Hello and welcome to Drunk on Tea. This week, in celebration of the end of Orktober, I'm going to be painting up an Ork Kommando. But because it's me, it's going to be a retro Ork Kommando model from the second edition of Warhammer 40,000. So the first thing I've done is I've primed the model black, as this will give us a nice, smooth, even base coat for the rest of our colours to work from. The first thing I'm going to do is come in with some Xeros purple, and for this I'm going to paint all of the uniform to the Ork Kommando. As we all know, orcs think purple makes things invisible, so if you're going to be a stealthy orc, you're going to want purple uniform. So with this, I'm just applying a couple of layers of Xeros purple all over the uniform parts to the orc, till I build up to a solid, smooth coverage of purple all over the uniform. So that's going to be the jacket, the trousers, and the hat to the orc. I'm going to make sure I coat all of these with a couple of layers of purple, just till I get a nice, smooth, solid base coat all over these areas. The coverage on this paint isn't fantastic, so it is going to take a few coats to build up to that solid coverage. We'll just wait for each one to dry and then come back in and apply another layer until we get that solid Xeros purple colour all over the uniform to the Ork Kommando. And after a couple of layers, you can see I've built up to that solid purple colour all over this uniform, so this orc will now believe he's invisible. So now I'm coming in with some Mournfang Brown, and we're going to paint this all over his backpack and any pouches to the model. Obviously be nice and careful around all the areas of purple that we've already painted. Just make sure you coat all of the backpack and any pouches with a couple of layers of Mournfang Brown. So there are some pouches dotted around on the front of the model. Just pick them out with a couple of layers of Mournfang Brown. So I know there's new Ork Kommando models that have come out for the last edition of Kill Team, so you can use this method to paint those as well. This doesn't just work on these classic old monopose Ork Kommando models. And after a couple of layers of Mournfang Brown, see I've picked out all of those pouches and his backpack. Next thing I'm going to paint is the rope that's tied to his backpack. For this I'll be using Steel Legion Drab. This will give us a slightly different colour of brown compared to the one we used for the backpack itself. Just apply a couple of layers of Steel Legion Drab all over the rope till we get a nice solid base colour all over the rope. Obviously be really careful around all the areas we've already painted. Just catch that rope with a couple of layers of Steel Legion Drab. And with the rope picked out, the next thing I'm going to paint on this Ork Kommando is the skin. For this, I'll be using wire flesh as a base coat. So I'm just going to pick out all of the skin on the model with a couple of layers of wire flesh. Once again, being careful around all of the other areas we've already painted, but just making sure I pick out all of the skin with some wire flesh. So on this model, the skin's just going to be the face and the hands. I'm just going to make sure I pick out any areas of exposed flesh on the model with a couple of layers of wire flesh. Don't forget to pick out the hands as well as the face. I'm also just catching these with a couple of layers of wire flesh. So it will take a couple of layers to build up to that solid coverage on the skin, but as always, just apply a couple of thin layers until we get a solid coat of wire flesh all over the skin areas. And after a couple of layers, you can see I've got a solid coat all over the skin. So next I'm going to pick out or any of the black details on the model. For this I'll be using Corvus Black. I'm going to apply this to the boots, obviously being really careful when I get up to the purple of his trousers. Just going to make sure I catch the boots with a couple of layers of Corvus Black. By using Corvus Black, it will allow us to shade these areas. And I'm also going to make sure I catch the handle to his axe as well. I'm just catching this with some Corvus Black as well. And with the black details picked out, the next I'm going to pick out is the gun. For this I'll be using Mephiston Red. I'm going to pick out all of the body to his shooter. By using Mephiston Red, it's going to give us that classic retro look, as this is a 2nd edition model. And as well as picking out the gun, I'm also going to make sure I pick out the Swiss Army knife hanging from his belt as well. So if you want a more modern look, you can pick out the gun casing with black. As this is a retro model, I'm going to give it the retro red gun. And with the shooter and the knife picked out, the next thing I'm going to pick out is just a few of the smaller details. So with some MacLeod blue, I'm going to pick out the tie hanging from this orc's neck. This will just add a little pop of colour and add some interesting variation to the model. So I'm just picking out this little tie area with a bit of MacLeod blue. And I'm also picking out the strapping on the axe as well. So I'm being really careful around the skin. Just make sure I pick out the strapping on the axe with a bit of MacLeod blue. And with the MacLeod blue applied, all that's left now is to paint any of the metallics on the model. So the first of the metallics I'm coming in with is Lead Belcher. For this I'm going to pick out all of the areas that I want to be sort of that silver metal. So I'm just going to be things like the axe head here, coating all of the axe head with a couple of layers of Lead Belcher, ensuring I get a nice smooth even coat. And I'm also going to pick out any of the metallic details on the gun as well. So the muzzle, the magazine, any of those areas, I'm just catching these with a couple of layers of Lead Belcher. With all of those metallic details picked out, there's only one left to pick out on this Ork Kommando, and that's going to be the buckle to his belt. For this I'll be using Retributor armor. I'm just going to carefully pick out the buckle with a layer of Retributor armor. Some of these orcs have got earrings and things. At that point, Retributor armor is great for picking out earrings and stuff as well. So after those metallics have been picked out, there's only a couple of details left to pick out on the model. First one of these is going to be the wires, which I'm picking out with some Death Guard green. So I'm picking out the wires here on the axe. And with that wire picked out, there is now just one final base coat left to apply to the model. And that's going to be with some Celestra Grey. I'm just going to pick out the white cross on his Swiss Army knife. Picking this out with a couple of layers of Celestra Grey, just so I get a nice white cross on the knife. And with that cross picked out, that is all of the base coats applied to the model. Now the next step is to shade the miniature. So the first shade I'm coming in with is Biltan Green. I'm going to use this to shade all of the skin. But obviously be careful around other colours, but make sure you catch all of the areas we paint with War Flesh with a coat of Biltan Green. Let this sink into all of the recesses, bring out that detail. So just make sure you catch all of the skin areas with some Biltan Green. And with some Caraborg Crimson. I'm going to shade all of the areas we painted purple. So it's going to be all of the uniform, the jacket, the trousers and the hat. Once again, being really careful around other colours. I'm making sure I shade all of that uniform with a layer of cardboard crimson. And now with Agrax Earthshade, I'm going to shade all the areas we paint with Mornfang Brown and Steel Legion Drab, so the backpack, the rope and all of the pouches. If at any point you realise this is putting a little bit too heavily, you can wick it away with a dry brush. And make sure you shade all of these areas with a bit of Agrax Earthshade. I'm also catching the belt buckle along with the pouches as well, as catching all of this with some Agrax Earthshade. And finally, with some Nuln Oil, I'm going to shade all of the other details. So it's going to be the gun casing, all the areas we paint with Lead Belcher, as well as the areas we paint with Macragge Blue, Corvus Black, and Death Guard Green. So just make sure you catch all the rest of the areas with a shade of Nuln Oil. If you're enjoying the video, please press like. If you want more videos, press the subscribe button and ring the notification bell. If you would like to support the channel and become a member, please press the join button down below. And after all of those shades have dried, you can see they've really added definition all over the model. So now it's time to start highlighting this Ork Kommando. First thing I'm going to highlight is going to be the skin. And to start with, I'm coming in with Warflesh again. And I'm going to paint this on all of the areas that the shades didn't settle. So wherever the Biltan green settled into a recess, I'm leaving the shade in that recess and coming in on either side and brightening the rest of the skin back up to its original colour of Warflesh. So you can see with all of the texture on the face, the shade has settled into a lot of the recesses. But I'm just picking out all of the areas that the shade didn't settle and catching them with a coat of Warflesh. For the fingers, it's mostly settled into the recesses between all the fingers, so I'm just bringing all of the flatter, raised areas back up to their original colour, but I'm leaving that shade paint showing in all of the recesses. And with the Warflesh applied, you can see how it's brightened up some of those flatter areas, but we can still see all of the definition of the shade showing in the recesses. So now I'm coming in with a 50-50 mix of Warflesh and Warboss Green. I'm going to apply this in the middle of the areas that we just applied the Warflesh. So wherever in the previous step we applied a bit of the Warflesh, I'm coming back in now and leaving a bit of the Warflesh showing on either side. I'm applying a bit of this mix in the middle of all of those areas. This will build up for a nice transition from the darkest recesses to our brightest highlights. So make sure you leave a little bit of the previous step showing through. On all of the larger, flatter areas, most raised details, apply a little bit of this mix as we start brightening those areas up towards our highlights. On the fingers, I'm focusing on areas like the pads of the fingers and the flatter surfaces, leaving a bit of the Warflesh showing through. And over a few layers, this is going to build up to a really nice transition to our brighter highlights. And with that mix applied, you can see how it's brightened up those flatter areas. We can still see a bit of all of our previous layers showing. So now I'm coming in with some pure Warboss Green. And much like before, I'm going to apply some of this into the middle of all of the areas we applied our previous step. So leave a little bit of the mix showing and apply a bit of pure Warboss Green in the middle of all of the areas that we just applied the Warboss Green Warflesh mix. So you really want to focus these now onto the sharpest points, flattest areas and most raised details, areas that the light would catch the most. making sure you leave those previous layers showing through, but also brightening them up with some pure Warboss green. So on the fingers here, I'm focusing it towards the most raised and highest points, applying just small parts of pure Warboss green in the middle of all the areas we applied our previous mix. And after that Warboss green has been applied, you can see it's really brightened up those areas of the skin. So there's just one final colour left to apply on the skin for our final highlight. And that will be an edge highlight of Ork flesh. For this, I'm really focusing it onto the sharpest points, most raised details. I'm just applying a really thin edge highlight of pure Ork flesh on all the top facing and sharpest surfaces. On the lips, I'm doing some sort of jaggedy lines just to give the impression of dry lips. And I'm really focusing this towards those sharpest points. So on the fingers here, it's just the highest folds, tips of the knuckles, areas like that. Just applying a small edge highlight of pure Ork flesh onto these sharpest points. And with the Ork flesh applied, that is the skin highlighted. You can see we've got a great transition from the darkest points to the lightest highlights. So now I'm going to pick out the eyes on the model. For this, I'll be using Abaddon Black first. This sculpt only has one eye open. So for this, I'm just applying a bit of Abaddon Black into the recesses of the eye socket. Now with some white scar, I'm just painting a small line of white within the black we just applied. We'll see if you've got one of the sculpts that has both eyes open, you'll be doing this for both eyes. And finally, with some Abaddon Black again, I'm just going to apply a small vertical line in the middle of the white we just applied. And this will give the impression of a pupil. And with the eye picked out, that's really finished off the face and added a great focal point for the model. So the next thing I'm going to start highlighting is the uniform. For this, I'm coming in with Xeros Purple again first, and much like with the skin, I'm applying this wherever the shade didn't settle. So wherever the Carroburg Crimson settled in a recess, I'm leaving that darker area, but coming in on either side and brightening the rest of the uniform back up with a layer of Xeros Purple. And this is highly textured uniform, so there's lots and lots of areas that the shade's settled in. So I'm coming in on all of the creases, all of the folds, all of the flat areas, and applying a layer of the original base paint to bring all of these areas back up to their brighter colour. Where this model here has a lot of pouches and pockets, I'm brightening all of the flat areas up, but making sure I leave that border of shade. So we're still keeping all of that definition from the shade paint, but we're brightening up any of the areas that the shade has darkened down. After applying that layer of Xeros Purple, you can see how we've brightened up those areas of uniform, but we've kept all of that definition from the shade paint. So now I'm coming in with a 50-50 mix of Xeros Purple and Genestealer Purple. I'm going to apply this into the middle of all the areas that we just applied the pure Xeros Purple. So make sure you leave a little bit of the pure base paint showing through, but apply some of this mix in the middle of all of the areas that we just applied the base paint. So much like with skin, we keep that transition from darkest up to lightest on all of the uniform. So on these larger, flatter areas here, I'm applying it in the middle, leaving that shade paint in the recesses and the original base colour showing around all the areas we're painting now. And on all of these folds here, I'm focusing into the middle of all the folds and creases. On some of these, I'm almost just painting a chunky edge highlight, making sure I leave enough room to come back in and paint another highlight. On the hat here, I'm just picking out all of these strands of texture, just catching these with a bit of this mix. And after that mix has been applied, you can see we're getting that really nice transition now, adding definition and detail all over that uniform. So there's just one final step left to apply, and that's with some pure Genestealer purple. I'm going to apply an edge highlight to all the sharpest points of the uniform. So all the details here, like the edges of the pockets, all of the creases and folds, I'm just catching the very sharpest points with an edge highlight of pure Genestealer purple. Keeping these lines nice and small, but just picking out any of the sharpest points with this edge highlight. See, some of the folds are really pronounced, so I'm catching the whole fold with a bit of Genestealer purple. And some of the smaller ones, I'm just catching the sharpest points with an edge highlight of Genestealer purple. On the arms here, I'm just focusing it to the very tops of all the creases, all the sharpest points, just catching them with a very thin edge highlight of Genestealer purple. And on the hat, I'm just catching the top points with a small spot. This will just give the impression of light catching on these details. And with that edge highlight of Genestealer purple applied, it's really made that uniform look interesting and added definition. So now with some Mournfang brown, we're going to start highlighting the backpack. So much like we've done in the previous layers, wherever the shade's settled, I'm leaving that, but coming in on either side and brightening the rest of the backpack back up to its original base colour. Doing much the same with the pouches as well. So all of the flatter, smoother areas, I'm just coating these with a thin layer of Mournfang brown to bring them back up to their original colour after the Agraxar shades darkened them down. With the Mournfang brown applied, you can see how we've brightened up the areas that were darkened by the shade. So now I'm coming in with a 50-50 mix of Mournfang brown and Scrag brown, and I'm going to apply this into the middle of all the areas that we applied the pure Mournfang brown. So you can be a little bit scratchy with some of these, as we're painting sort of a leathery effect. Just make sure you leave a bit of the Mournfang brown showing and Agraxar shade in all of the recesses, but brighten some of the flatter areas up with a little bit of this 50-50 mix. Some of these details are very small, so we're just applying a small spot of this Mournfang brown Scrag brown mix just to brighten these areas up. You can see how it's brightened up the highest points. It's giving the impression of light catching. So there's just one final highlight left to apply to all the pouches, and that's going to be with some Scrag brown. I'm applying a thin edge highlight on all the sharpest points and most raised details. So I want to keep these lines quite small and just apply a thin edge highlight of Scrag brown on any of the sharpest points to the pouches and the backpack. On the pouches, I'm mostly just catching the sharpest edges, so the very edges of all the pouches, tops of the folds, details like that. I'm just catching these with a very thin edge highlight of Scrag brown. And with the backpack and pouches highlighted, really making this model come together now. So now I'm coming in with some Evil Sun Scarlet, and I'm going to start highlighting the gun. For this, I'm applying this as a chunky edge highlight on all of the raised details to his gun. And so at the edges of every panel, every detail, every edge, I'm applying a chunky edge highlight of Evil Sun Scarlet. This will allow us to come back in our next step and apply a thinner edge highlight within all of these lines we're painting now. So you want to keep these lines fairly small, but make sure that they're large enough that you can apply another highlight within these highlights. So really take your time at this stage. Just work your way around that gun, applying a chunky edge highlight of Evil Sun Scarlet to the edges of all of the panels to his weapon. And I'm also doing the same around the edge of the Swiss Army knife as well. So this is a very small detail. I'm just applying a chunky edge highlight of Evil Sun Scarlet around the edges of the knife. With that Evil Sun Scarlet applied, you can see how it's emphasised the edges of all of these details, given a nice sharp appearance to all the details on the gun. So now I'm coming in with some Wild Rider Red. I'm going to apply a very thin edge highlight within the Evil Sun Scarlet we just applied. So you want to keep this highlight as small as you can, leaving a little bit of the Evil Sun Scarlet showing through, but just catch the very sharpest points and details with a really thin edge highlight of Wild Rider Red. You want to keep this as small as possible, just allow a tiny bit of the Evil Sun Scarlet to show through. This two-stage highlight gives a great impression of sharpness and detail on the red of his gun casing. Much like before, I'm also doing the same to the Swiss Army knife as well, keeping this line as fine as I can and just catching the very edge with a really thin edge highlight of Wild Rider Red. And with that Wild Rider Red applied, you can see it's really made that casing to the gun pop and added some interest and detail. So the next I'm going to highlight are his boots. For this I'm using Mechanica Standard Grey. I'm just going to pick out any of the raised details or sharpest folds on the boots with a thin edge highlight of Mechanica Standard Grey. So there are some folds and buckles and details like that on the boots, so I'm just giving these a really small edge highlight with Mechanica Standard Grey, keeping the lines nice and thin, and just catching the most raised and sharpest details with this really thin edge highlight. And with the boots highlighted, we're really moving into some of the smaller details on the model now. So the next one I'm going to highlight is the rope. For this I'm using Zandri Dust. I'm just going to very carefully apply this as a small spot highlight on all of the notches to the rope. So for each one of these I'm trying to very carefully just catch them with a small line of Zandri Dust, leaving that Agrax shade showing in all the recesses. You don't need to catch every single detail, just try and catch as many as you can. The rope highlighted. The next one thing I'm going to highlight is his necktie and the strapping on his axe. For this I'll be using Calgar Blue. I'm just going to very carefully pick out the sharpest points to this tie with some Calgar Blue, just focusing onto the most prominent and raised folds. And doing much the same to the strapping on the axe as well, just a thin edge highlight of Calgar Blue on all the sharpest details. With all the blue details highlighted, we're now into some of the smallest ones on the model. So the next one I'm going to highlight is the wire on his power axe. For this I'll be using Ogryn Camo. I'm just going to very carefully apply a line of Ogryn Camo going along the top of each of the wires. This will just make them stand out and give the impression of light catching the top of the wire. The wire is highlighted. The next tiny detail I'm going to paint is the white cross on the Swiss Army knife. For this, I'm using White Scar, and I'm just going to very carefully pick out the very edges of the raised cross with some White Scar. So I'm picking out the edges first, and then just connecting them up with a tiny spot of White Scar. Now that the white cross has been highlighted, it's time to highlight the final few details, which are the metallics. So first of all, I'm coming in with Liberator Gold. I'm just going to highlight the buckle on the belt. So I'm catching the very edge and the raised marking with a small spot of Liberator Gold. It's time for the one final highlight to apply to this Ork Kommando, and that's going to be to highlight all of the final metal details. So for this, I'll be using Stormhose Silver. Just going to apply a final edge highlight to the head of the axe, catching the edges, and also trying to catch the sharp blade as well. Make sure I catch all the sharp edges with a highlight of Stormhose Silver. And I'm also going to pick out any of the sharp edges on the metallic parts to the gun as well. So I'm just catching all of these final details with an edge highlight of Stormhose Silver on all the metallic areas to the gun. And with that Stormhose Silver applied, that is how to paint a retro Ork Kommando fitting for Orktober. So let me know in the comments down below, were there any other Ork models you would like to see me paint, or what have you been painting this Orktober? So thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and happy painting!